welcome to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. I am your host, John Viscardo. We are back with the great Jon Parshall, author of a new book, 1942, The Crux of War. Hello, John.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am living the dream here in Minnesota.
Yeah. John joins us from Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're happy to have him on the call. Today we're going to talk about a guy, a very famous commander, Yamamoto of the Japanese Imperial Army. But before we do that, I did want to talk about your book, which will be coming out soon, 2026, looking like June timeframe. If you want to learn more about the book, please go to 1942book.com. John, what is this book about?
It's basically, it's talking about how the Allies turned around their train wrecks in what I think is the most crucial year of the war. You've now got, both the Japanese and the Americans now join the war in December. And so this book covers from December 1941 to December 1942, that 13-month time span. And I'm basically arguing that 42 is the hinge point of the entire war. All the big dogs are in the game at this point. And now we can finally get a sense for who is going to win this war. And it's not at all obvious when we come into it. I mean, the first, honestly, 5 or 6 months, 7 months even, are just terrible for the Allies. It's going badly everywhere.
Right.
And to the average man or woman on the street, looking around and, trying to figure out who's going to win this thing, it's not at all obvious that the Allies are going to actually end up being the victors.
It's like the turning point of the war.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, It is. And one of the things I'm trying to push back on, I will admit, is that I think it's become fashionable in the last, 15, 20 years or so. There's been a rise of what I would term Eastern Front determinism. So with the failure of Operation Barbarossa, which is the invasion of the Soviet Union, in, the summer or fall of 1941, pick your scholar, that it's trendy to say, well, the Germans can no longer beat the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht can't do it against the Red Army. Therefore, the war is decided. And I'm like, that's ludicrous to say that for a number of reasons. First of all, again, to draw that analogy out to its logical conclusion, you are essentially saying that this war is in the bag before the U.S. and the Japanese are even in the war. I think that that's ridiculous. The other thing is that I think that a lot of the Eastern Front literature tends to overfocus on the military aspects of that campaign and underfocuses on what's going on in the Soviet domestic economy, which is absolutely on a knife's edge all through 1942. The wheels could totally have come off that economy. And if that happens, the Russian economy had fallen apart in World War I, just 20 years prior,
Right.
Under economic circumstances that were not nearly as dire as the ones that the Soviets are now facing in 1942. They've lost 40% of their population, 40% of their GDP. The majority of their food production is in Ukraine, So how are you going to keep the lid on that from a societal standpoint? There's a lot of stuff going on there.
Okay. And there's good quotes and maps in the book as well.
Absolutely, yeah. It's got about 140 maps. I did all the maps. I'm a map kind of guy. It's a large book. It's about 1,200 pages. But yeah, it'll be coming out from Oxford University on June 1st, 2026.
All right. We'll be looking for that. Again, the website, if you want to learn more, is 1942book.com. So please check that out.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm glad you're joining me for this episode. Because in my mind, when it comes to admirals of World War II, Yamamoto's name is up there with Nimitz and Halsey and all the other greats. What made this man so unique?
Well, I think, his calling card was and always will be the attack on Pearl Harbor. I think that particular attack is just stamped on our collective memory as Americans because it was just such a stunning occurrence, in that the Japanese in 1941 were an undervalued enemy. And then at Pearl Harbor, all of a sudden they just blow the doors off and pull off this stunning attack. And there are a lot of people in the U.S. that are like, whoa. How did this happen? How is it possible that we were surprised by this particular adversary?
Yeah.
And that has led to any number of conspiracy theories that still reverberate to this day. So Yamamoto's the architect of that attack, that right there puts him front and center for us forever.
But you and I were talking before the call. There's more to him. He's not just some commander. Like, he's a diplomat.
Yeah.
He's an educator. He's a really smart guy.
He's a really interesting guy. He's a very complex guy. Yes, he's highly educated. He's been to the U.S. He was a naval attaché. He was also a part of the diplomatic group that comes over to negotiate the Washington Naval Treaty. And so this is a guy who has had a lot of exposure to America and Americans, knows us, and really understands our industrial potential too. So, yeah, he's got that diplomat aspect to him. During the interwar period, he is named as the head of the Navy's Bureau of Aviation. And so he's a real aviation pioneer. He's not a pilot himself, but he puts a lot of money and a lot of time in trying to beef up Japan's carrier force and also their aviation element, which is going to be crucial. And then he is also a product of a military system, obviously, and we can see elements of that in his war planning as well.
Yeah, let's talk about his background a little bit. He's born in 1884 in Nagaoka, Japan.
Yeah, Nagaoka.
The son of a former samurai. How did Yamamoto's samurai background influence kind of his discipline and worldview?
That's a great question. And it's tricky, too, because within Japan, the fact that the samurai had essentially been shunted to the side by the reforms of the Meiji Constitution and that sort of thing meant that a lot of these former samurai families were in many cases destitute. You know, they haven't got another way of making a living now that they're sort of out of business, if you will, that their military system has been replaced by what we would look at as sort of classic Western style militaries. So a lot of these individuals, you know, would have a bit of a chip on their shoulder. And yet at the same time, that whole Bushido code, you know, figures into the Japanese modern military as well. It has a number of elements that we would look at as Westerners and we would say, well, that's kind of anachronistic. You know, the sense of personal honor, a lot of shame gets built into this sort of worldview as well. But two, in terms of war planning, he would also be very much a product of an Eastern mindset in that they look at Western thinkers like Alfred Thayer Mahan, and they say that that guy is really important. But from a planning standpoint, they would look at Chinese people like Sun Tzu, and there are a lot of Eastern elements that get dragged in too. So I guess to sum up, he is a product of all of those influences, and the samurai background is just one piece in the kit bag.
Right. Right, because it seems to me, you know, he honors his father, and he's very big on discipline, but he also wants to learn new things. Like he wants to be progressive as well.
Absolutely.
Well, he enters the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, graduates in 1904. What kind of officer do you think he was in his early academy years?
Well, I will say that the Imperial Navy at this point in time was long on discipline and very harsh discipline. And so Yamamoto would have been subjected to that as he's going through that system as well, just like everybody else was. It's important to follow orders. It's important to follow them extremely quickly without a lot of thinking. And so I can't imagine that did not chafe, because Yamamoto very clearly was a man who had his own opinions about things. He was not a sheep, but yeah, you know, he's got to come up through the ranks. He's got to do his midshipman cruises and first deployments and all that stuff. So
yeah, and he serves in the Russo-Japanese War at the Battle of Tsushima, where he's wounded and loses two fingers. But also, you know, the Japanese kind of shocked the world and beat the Russian Navy, right?
Yeah, no, that's a huge victory. I mean, that's really the first time that a Western power has been defeated by an Asian power. And yeah, that was a real eye-opener. You know, the Russians sent this fleet all the way around, you know, thousands and thousands of miles, in some cases around the Cape of Good Hope. And yeah, they come up through the Straits of Tsushima and just get absolutely plastered, just blasted.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's one of the most, it is a decisive defeat. And actually there's a seed of disaster that is sown there, I think, for the Japanese Navy as a whole. This defeat is so decisive for the Russians that it essentially ends the war in favor of the Japanese. It's not quite that simple, but a lot of people look at this as, that's the turning point in the war. That's when it's clearly over. And what that plants in the mind of people like Yamamoto and the Navy as a whole is that you can win a war just by winning one battle. So this quest for what they call a decisive sea battle is something that then infects that Navy for the rest of its history. And so they carry that lesson forward to their planning against the Americans, too, that all we have to do is win one big climactic sea battle against the American battle line, and we're going to decide the war in our favor. And unfortunately, World War II era United States is an entirely different animal than Tsarist Russia in 1905.
That's a really good point. We'll come back to that. But yeah, Yamamoto studies later on at Harvard, 1919 to 1921, and later serves as naval attaché in Washington.
Yeah.
So how do you think his time in America shaped his understanding of U.S. industry and culture? I know he learns to speak English as well.
He speaks English, he travels extensively, and this is one of the sort of the fracture lines that you see within the Japanese military as a whole, that the Navy is often more, what I would say, cosmopolitan than the Imperial Army is. And Yamamoto is sort of emblematic of that. I mean, this is a guy who has traveled widely within the U.S., not only on the East Coast, but he's been in the American heartland too. And so he's been to what is now the Rust Belt, but was back in the 1920s and 30s, the largest manufacturing complex in the world. This, span of real estate that starts in upstate New York, goes all the way across the Great Lakes through places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit, obviously, and so Yamamoto went through all of that, and he had an extremely healthy appreciation for the industrial power of the United States.
It's not Tsarist Russia.
It's not Tsarist Russia, exactly. Yeah. The industrial potential of the U.S. vis-a-vis Japan just is awe-inspiring and absolute. Even by the time you get to the eve of the Pacific War, internal Japanese estimates were estimating that America had 20 times the manufacturing power that Japan did, even though Japan was a major world power by this point in time. It's almost hard to imagine just how powerful America was by that point in time. We represented a third of the world's energy consumption and probably close to 40% of the total GDP. Yeah. Just a monster.
And we'll come back to his warnings that were ignored here in a minute. But yeah, he kind of rises in the Navy, gains recognition for his expertise in aviation and modernization of the fleet. Why do you think he championed naval aviation over battleships? Again, I mean, this is against traditional thinking at the time.
Yeah, well, aviation is, pardon the pun, is just taking off in the 20s, and you have people like Lindbergh making his cross-Atlantic flight. That inspired entire generations of people, not just in America but worldwide. If you were a young man in the 20s and 30s who was adventurous and technically minded, you wanted to be a pilot or be involved with aviation. It's the nearest thing to being, part of the American space program in the 60s. That's where all the cool kids wanted to hang out. Planes were it, man. They were cool.
Right. They were new.
I guess from a career development standpoint too, if you're a product of a military system and suddenly there's this kind of greenfields opportunity to potentially get in on the ground floor of this new military service, a lot of the ambitious cool cats inside the military, not only in Japan, but the same thing is true in Britain, Germany, any place. That was a place where careers could be made, to the point that you see people like Halsey and Ernest King likewise are reinventing themselves during this time period, even though they're too old. Cats like Halsey are like, no, damn it, I'm going to go back and I'm going to get my wings, and I'm going to be a pilot so that I can get in on this career path. And Yamamoto's the same breed of cat.
That's a really great point. Yeah. I mean, I think Halsey was the oldest to get his wings like at
Yep.
52. Like he knew that it was important to learn this new technology.
Yeah. And Ernest King, same thing. So yeah, that's Yamamoto himself is not an aviator, but he very much sees that air power can do interesting things within the broader expanses of the Pacific Ocean. And so he aligns himself with the other sort of pioneers within the Japanese military. Guys who, if you're a Pacific War historian, you would recognize names like these, Ozawa, who's going to be the main carrier admiral in places like Battle of the Philippine Sea. Inoue Shigeyoshi, likewise, a little more obscure. He's the guy who's in command at Battle of Coral Sea from a theater standpoint. So there's kind of a clique within the Japanese Navy that are very air-minded and think that the whole battleship orthodoxy is just, that's old news and it's going to be superseded by aircraft.
I was just thinking about it, and I think you hit upon it. Like within 20 years, you're going to have naval battles where the fleets don't even see each other. They're not even going to be within range of each other, but they're still going to have naval battles via airplanes.
Which would have been was inconceivable in the 1920s. Right. If you had spouted something like that, hey, in 20 years, we aren't even going to have to sight the other guy's, battle line in order to bring them to battle. The big gun orthodoxy would be like, you're high. That's never going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's kind of approach World War II now. Yamamoto has opposition to the war with the U.S., warning that Japan could only win for 6 months to a year. Why did he believe war with the U.S. was ultimately unwinnable?
It goes back again to his experiences in the U.S. This is a guy that has a firsthand appreciation of the industrial potential of America and is like, this is a very, very bad idea to go to war with these guys. And if you look through the source material, this whole business of I will run wild for the first 6 months to a year, there are several different renditions of that quote, because he says it to several different people. During this run up to war in 1941, generally speaking, but particularly from like July of 1941 onward, which is when the Americans put this oil embargo in against the Japanese. This is not a war that the Japanese had really planned for. I mean, the immediate post-war myth when I was a kid growing up, it was always, the reason the Japanese were so successful with their early campaigns is because they had been meticulously planning these for decades in advance. That's all malarkey, complete malarkey. The Japanese had no notion that they were going to be getting into a war with the Western powers. The earliest, some of their divisional staffs started mulling about, could we do operations in Southeast Asia? The soonest that happened is actually around the fall of France in May of 1940. It really doesn't get kicked into high gear, like I say, until July of 1941. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, we're going to run out of oil. The spigot's been turned off. What are we going to do if we're going to actually fight? So unfortunately, what ends up happening for Japan, this is sort of a tragic period because it's a period of real fecklessness and a lack of leadership on the part of the top political decision makers within Japan, in that there are a lot of private conversations happening between people like Yamamoto and his boss, Admiral Nagano, who's the chief of the naval staff, where people are asking questions, do you think you can beat the Americans? And people like Yamamoto are like, no. And so those private conversations are happening. And in some of those cases, you're getting a sort of a candid exchange of information. But from a public standpoint, all of these leaders have got public-facing faces that they have to put out there for public consumption that are belligerent and bellicose and war-minded, because they know that if they don't toe the proper line in terms of belligerency, that there are junior officers that may assassinate them for their opinions. I mean, this is very much a thing in Japan in the interwar period. A number of prime ministers have been killed because they were not sufficiently militaristic. So Yamamoto is being relatively straightforward, as was his wont, but the result is that the political dynamics within Japan are militating towards war, and that's what ends up happening.
So he's made commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, appointed in 1939, gives him control over Japan's naval operations. So, what are his priorities at the outset? Is it to grab raw materials? Is it to knock out the American fleet? What are his priorities?
One of the reasons he gets named as commander in chief of Combined Fleet was to get him out of Tokyo, where he might have been assassinated, because he was the kind of cat who would say things like, no, we should not fight the Americans. That would be a really bad idea. During the war planning process, as we're kicking this off, leading up to war, the overall game plan for the Japanese has to be grabbing resources. Oil is the driver here. And it's the Imperial Navy that once that oil embargo goes on, they're the ones that are really sort of leading the charge and are convincing the Army that, you need to pry your attention away from the Soviets and, what's going on in Mongolia and places like that. And you need to get focused on down south. That's where the oil is. There ain't no oil in Mongolia. We got to go to Java, particularly Sumatra. That's where we got to go. And so the whole war plan really is this charge to the south, that they're going to invade places like Malaya to isolate Java, both east and west, and they're going to eventually grab Java. It's Java that is the centerpiece of this operation. Americans tend to say, well, Pearl Harbor was the centerpiece of this whole thing. It's like, no. Pearl Harbor can be viewed as tactically offensive, but operationally and strategically defensive, in that what it is designed to do is to put the American battle fleet out of business for 6 months so that we, the Japanese, can do this massive assault to the south.
They create a sphere of influence where the Americans can't stop us. Yeah,
exactly.
Let's talk about Yamamoto's personal life a little bit. I know he was married with 4 kids, and he also enjoyed gambling, which segues nicely into my next topic. What was his personal life like?
Kind of a mess. He was not meeting his wife's emotional needs. She was not meeting his emotional needs. I mean, he's got multiple mistresses, and that's just kind of, he was a very complex guy. And he's also a guy who was away at sea a lot. And so he was not at home. And this is not what we would look at as a perfect father figure, I guess I would say. He's not a soccer dad, right? He's just not. I think he's got a fairly healthy self-regard. Nobody who gets promoted to a position of, being in charge of your main battle fleet doesn't think fairly well of himself. On the other hand, he's pretty gregarious. He's easy to get along with. He has pretty good relations with a lot of his subordinates. And as you say, he is a bit of a gambler. He likes cards. He likes playing shogi and chess. He does have a streak to him, which is he is a risk taker. And he demonstrated that, obviously, as soon as he got interested in aviation. That's another thing that we also forget, is just how dangerous aviation was at that time.
Yeah.
If you're going to fly airplanes, you've got to probably, a 50-50 chance that you're going to end up dead in these early things. And that was just the nature of the beast. And so Yamamoto brings with him a risk-taking element, and that obviously informs the planning for Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
What risks did he see in attacking Pearl Harbor, and why did he proceed? Was it the Warhawks in Tokyo tell him to do it, or did he think
this is his baby? And it's a little bit murky as to when he actually started thinking about this, but the seeds at least had been planted in the middle of 1940, that he had been mulling on this notion that if we do end up going to war with the U.S., how are we going to turn the tables on this thing? Because if we just get into a straight up attritional contest with these guys, they're going to clean our clocks. We cannot hold out against the Americans in a long-term war. So that means that we need to do something stunning and dramatic at the outset of that war. And some of that has to be aimed at America's morale. That we all understand that war making is not necessarily a strictly rational business, right? That morale is super important. So if I'm going to chip away at America's morale and hopefully get them to a place where they're just like, screw it, this isn't worth it, we're going to throw in the towel, we got other things to focus on, I need to hit them in the face right off the bat with something that's so stunning and outsized that it looks like, we're just not going to be able to come back from this. And the coin of the realm at this point is battleships. That's how everybody measures naval power these days. So the Americans have got 17 battleships in commission. And these vessels embody they're today's equivalent would be fleet carriers in our Navy, right? They cost a ton of money. They take years and years and years to build. And the loss of even one or two of them would be seen as tantamount to a national catastrophe. His goal in Pearl Harbor is to knock out a third of our battleships. I want to sink 5 of these things. And that's going to just be such a stunning blow to the Americans that hopefully that will induce them to just come to the bargaining table and we can get this thing over with via negotiation rather than war fighting.
Yeah, and I've been to Pearl Harbor. It's a very moving place.
Yeah.
We were lucky, though, that none of the aircraft carriers were there, though, right?
That's absolutely right. And we can talk a little bit about that, too. But the horrific risks involved in this attack, though, from the Japanese standpoint, they're alarming. You're going to basically try to bring a carrier force across 3,500 nautical miles of water. And that means that you've got to develop underway replenishment, which was not a thing back then. The Japanese actually do some really innovative things in that respect, too. And if this attack does not go well, if the Japanese end up losing a substantial component of their carrier force, that in turn imperils this whole southern advance as well. So, when he presents his plan to Naval GHQ, which is his boss, they're like, again, you're high. We're not going to go for this, right?
Well, yeah, and you make a good point there. You have to 3,500 miles without being detected, with replenishing yourself because you're going to be out in the middle of nowhere.
Yep.
And once you get there, winning a battle that maybe the Americans are ready for you and you lose. So there's a lot of dangers in this.
A hell of a lot of dangers. Exactly. What Yamamoto ends up resorting to, frankly, is some skullduggery on his part, in that when Naval GHQ balks at his plan, he says, fine, I'm going to resign and my entire staff is going to resign too, which is blackmail. When you think about it, I mean, you are on the eve of the most consequential war in Japan's history. And what do you mean you're going to resign unless you don't get your way? What the actual? That's
a little ego there. Yeah.
Hell yeah. There was. But he gets away with it. And this is going to have really bad ramifications, for the rest of his command tenure, because having played that blackmail card once, he knows he can play it again. He's going to play it before Midway as well. So anyway, he does get his way.
It's a stunning tactical victory, but it's a strategic gamble. And I want to talk about his reaction to the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, because we've all seen the famous quote. It's in the movie Pearl Harbor, quote, "I fear all we've done is to awaken a sleeping giant," end quote. But that never happened, right?
Never happened. That was a brilliant screenwriter. I don't know who the screenwriter was, but yeah. The Japanese Navy nerderati has gone through all of the, source material numerous times. Is like, yeah, Yamamoto, so far as we can tell, never ever said that. But he might have. It might as well have. I mean, it perfectly encapsulates, what actually happens as a result of that attack.
He's probably patting himself on the back too, like, hey, it did what we wanted it to. It got the battleships knocked out.
Yeah, they knocked out 5 battleships. As you mentioned earlier, the carriers were not there, which was a bummer. And, a lot of the aviators in the carrier task force, Kido Butai, were very disappointed by that. From a tactical standpoint, we tend to look at this operation, we say it was brilliant. If you dig into it, the Japanese actually left a lot of stuff on the table, I guess I would say.
But it was a minimal loss on their part, a few airplanes.
Yeah, although a lot were damaged. They lost 29 planes, but over 100 were actually damaged, out of a total force of around 400 aircraft. No, don't get me wrong. It absolutely was a successful attack tactically. There are ways that they could have played their cards better to have done things like attacked some of the heavy cruisers and light cruisers that were available.
Yeah, there was a third wave, right, that he didn't release.
That whole thing is a myth. Down through the years, there's been this whole notion of, they should have attacked the fuel tanks and all that stuff. That is all malarkey and is the result of post-war fabrications by a guy named Mitsuo Fuchida. He made all that stuff up. Mm-hmm. And it got implanted into Tora Tora Tora, which has been viewed by millions of people, and therefore it is now cemented in our collective memory that, oh, they should have gone after the fuel tanks there. That was a huge mistake. Actuality, Nagumo and his crew never had any intention of attacking those fuel tanks. So
Okay.
it's never going to happen.
Well, let's move on because, into your book now, Turning Points, 1942. We have the Battle of Midway. Yamamoto's fleet suffers catastrophic losses. So what happened to the Gambler here, and how did it alter the course of the war?
So much to unpack there. Yes. The problem you see at Midway, big picture, is that from a battle planning standpoint,
do we have their codes now? Yeah, that helps.
Yeah, it never hurts. Although you got to be careful about that. I think that there's again one of these sort of interpretational pendulums that you see swinging in history. When the first books came out on the code breaking in the late 1980s, there's this notion that if you are reading the other guy's mail and you know he's coming, you should win the battle, right? It should be that simple. Game over. You know they're coming. There's a big difference in having operational level intel on enemy intentions and rough timetables, and being able to actually translate that into meaningful results on the battlefield. The analog I always use is that the British were getting great intelligence in the northern desert against Rommel. It didn't do them any good because their army just was not good enough to defeat the Africa Corps up until October of 1942. They just couldn't get it done on the ground. And so it's an open question. After 6 months of this war, which has been a dumpster fire, are our carrier aviators good enough to get it done against the Japanese?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you can be the best coach in the NFL, but if you don't have the players fighting the game, then you're not gonna win. So yeah, that's a good point.
It's not going to work. But what's going on then from a battle planning standpoint, Yamamoto is convinced that the American Navy is morally beaten by this point and that they're going to have to be lured out of Pearl Harbor and bring them out to battle somehow, which results in a battle plan that has a lot of different formations that are running around that are not mutually supporting. And what that means is that even though, if you look at the aggregate number of Japanese warships that are running around in the Pacific doing something on the date of Midway, they got a hell of a lot of warships out there. At the tip of the spear, right off of Midway itself, you've got a Japanese carrier force that has 4 aircraft carriers and 248 carrier planes and about 20 warships, going up against an American force of 3 aircraft carriers, 276 carrier planes, another 100 on Midway. So we outnumber them in aircraft. We've got 4 runways, one of which on Midway cannot be sunk, and we know they're coming. That's a pretty even matchup. We have some problems. Obviously, our submarines don't perform as well as Nimitz would have hoped. The land-based air groups on Midway likewise don't perform terribly well. And so it really does come down to, at the end of the day, our 3 carriers versus their 4 carriers.
In that particular battle, there's so many command decisions. Like the
There's
Japanese,
a lot of stuff going on.
With do we do dive bombers or do we make the planes into torpedo bombers? And there's they have 15 minutes to decide, and then they change their minds. There's so many little tactical decisions that alter the battle. I don't think it's Yamamoto's fault entirely. It just is one of those things. It just didn't go their way that day.
It didn't go their way that day. And the same is true for Nagumo, the admiral in charge. I argue in Shattered Sword that he actually fights that battle on reasonably doctrinally congruent lines. It's just the decisions he ended up making were not, unfortunately, optimal. And so, the Japanese end up just taking it on the chin, and they lose 4 of their aircraft carriers there. The one thing I would point out, too, the other huge advantage that we have in that battle that are hardly ever talked about is the advantage in scouting assets. That carriers are incredibly fragile beasts, and it really comes down to who can attack effectively first. And that means that he who has the most scouting assets is the most likely to find his opponent first, and therefore hopefully get his strike packages up first. And we've got that in spades in that battle because we're running, a dozen or more PBY Catalinas out of Midway, and we know that they're coming. And so, if you just kind of do a breakdown of the number of aircraft that the Japanese have out looking for us versus the number of aircraft we have out looking for them, we got them like 2-1. And that's why we are able to get our attacks in first that end up devastating their carrier fleet.
Scouting is critical.
Scouting is critical.
Napoleon, when he didn't have a cavalry force after Russia, that's when he started to falter because he didn't know how big the enemy was or where they were. And he didn't have the horses like he had before Russia.
That is absolutely true. Scouting is one of these unsung kind of things. We tend to focus on the firepower elements, but man, yeah, scouting is huge.
Let's talk about the Solomon Islands campaign after Midway. Again, Yamamoto's kind of overseeing operations. How did his decisions affect Japanese chances in the Solomon Islands?
They affected them very deleteriously, I would say.
Is he a genius or is he just losing his mojo? Like what's happening?
No, and this is not just Yamamoto's fault. This is, again, a product of Japanese naval doctrine between the wars, which, again, is based on this notion of the war is going to be decided in a decisive sea battle. And I would argue that it takes the Japanese a lot longer than the Americans, a lot more time, to just get their heads around the fact that this Guadalcanal, this is the decisive battle. And you know what? It doesn't look or smell anything like the pre-war doctrinal, tenets said. Japanese doctrine said that this decisive battle is going to be a blue water affair. It's going to be fought out in the Marshall Islands someplace. Climactic clash of the battle lines and all that stuff. That's what their head says. And yet, if you look at the context of 1942, the Solomon Islands campaign really is, I would argue, the crucial campaign of that year, more so than Midway. Midway is what I would say is the gift that keeps on giving. What Midway does for us as the Americans is it creates parity of carrier forces within the Pacific. We now have roughly as many flight decks as they do, which then gets us out of this defensive crouch that we've been in for the first 6 months of this war and allows us to start thinking about where do we want to counterattack and how. Ernest King, who's the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Navy at this time, just seizes that opportunity, right now. And within 2 months, we're going to have counterattacked at Guadalcanal, which was crazy fast. We didn't have the logistical basis to do that. It was nuts. And it was nuts from the Japanese standpoint, too. They did not anticipate that we would be able to start counterattacking that quickly. One of the things that you see then throughout that campaign is that the Japanese are always kind of a day late and a dollar short emotionally in just investing the resources in that campaign that they needed to win. They had opportunities to do that, but there are a number of case examples that I can kind of trot out here. So, for instance, during the October time span, they came down with a group of 2 battleships. This is October 13th and 14th, and they put a battleship bombardment onto Henderson Field that just knocked us in the kisser. They should have been doing that every week. They should have been bringing down a force. Same thing happens during the first naval battle of Guadalcanal this is November 13th. They bring down another battleship bombardment forces, the second time that they've attempted this. They were using their Congo-class fast battleships. These are old battle cruisers, very useful vessels. They've been, because they're fast. And they could have brought 4 of those puppies down. In fact, 2 of them were left kind of circling up around Ontong Java Atoll, which is about 400 miles north of Guadalcanal. Why didn't they bring down all 4? The reason they didn't bring down all 4, there's a number of things that go into that. They didn't have the right kind of ammunition for bombardment. There may have been fuel problems. But if you kind of look at on the opposite side, you got Admiral Halsey, who at this point in time is just, he's all in, man. Anything I got, I'm pushing into the center of the table. The Japanese are like, yeah, it's the decisive battle, and we're all kind of in, but they're never willing to just push all the chips in, bring all the battleships. Hell, up a truck, you've got Yamato, which is the biggest battleship in the world. You've got, the Mutsu, which is a 16-inch gun ship. But nevertheless, they had the assets, but they never committed them to actually winning.
Yeah, hit them the fastest with the mostest.
The mostest, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about demise. I want to talk about Operation Vengeance, which I really don't know much about. U.S. forces intercepted his flight. I guess Yamamoto was touring his sphere of influence there.
He came down to Rabaul, which is the main naval base. It's at the tip of New Britain. That's the hub for their campaign, both in the Solomons and down in New Guinea. He's going to go on an inspection trip. He's going to go over to Bougainville.
So, how did American intelligence succeed in targeting Yamamoto, and why is his death such a blow to Japan?
Code breaking. We broke the codes that indicated, and this is very fortuitous, but by this point in time, which is 1943, middle of 1943, as opposed to the early war where we didn't have a lot of code breakers at all, now we got thousands of analysts who are, just constantly cracking this stream of intel. And we get wind of the fact that, yeah, he's going to be at Rabaul, and he is going to fly over to Bougainville to have this inspection tour. And so you get out the calipers and you're like, well, flying time from here to here is roughly X, and therefore if we want to intercept him at this location, he should be there roughly around Y. And at that point we now are using P-38 Lightnings, which is a pretty long ranged fighter, especially if you can put belly tanks under it and this kind of thing. And so that fighter has got just enough range that it can reach all the way out from Guadalcanal and potentially intercept him. Then there's sort of the command element. Do you want to assassinate an enemy general in that fashion, and by so doing, potentially jeopardize the intelligence that has led to that?
Yeah, there's that great scene in The Imitation Game where they're like, well, we have the intelligence. Do we act on every little note we get? Because then they'll know that we broke the code.
Bingo. That's exactly right. But eventually the decision is made that he's the best admiral they got, and we should get rid of him. And so...
Well, it's a gamble on his part too, right? Because I think his staffers told him not to go, and he only had 2 escort fighters with him. Like, it was
4, I think, but it was a handful.
But he didn't need to go, or maybe in his mind he needed to go. But I don't know. It seems like a dangerous risk in hindsight.
Although, just from a leadership standpoint, if you're doing your thing, there are plenty of other examples along these same lines. Halsey flew into Guadalcanal during that campaign. So did Nimitz. Mm-hmm. Chiang Kai-shek was flying into Chinese battlefields in 1942 that were extraordinarily dangerous. The Japanese had air superiority, and that dude was flying all over the place. So if showing the flag as a big time leader is important for the morale of your men, and again, morale is important. So yeah, I think Yamamoto felt that he had to do this, and unfortunately the result was that he did get intercepted, and a couple of these P-38s got into range, and yeah, they took down his bomber and the other bomber that was coming along with him with his chief of staff and whatnot. And yeah, they shot those planes down, killed him.
Well, when we talk about legacy, he's seen as both a brilliant strategist and a tragic figure who knew Japan could not win the war. I mean, top 5 admirals of war, too, wouldn't you say? What is his legacy?
That's complex. I did not see him as that great of a planner. That's my problem with him, is that I think that if you look at Midway as a battle plan, it was hopelessly flawed. There were a lot of problems with the Pearl Harbor battle plan too, I would argue, in particular the inclusion of mini-subs in that overall plan, because Pearl Harbor is all based on the element of surprise. And trying to sail, a group of tiny submarines up the narrow waterway into a harbor that is full of thousands and thousands and thousands of eyeballs. The one submarine that actually did make it in there, funniest thing, many hundreds of people saw that submarine. So for my money, Yamamoto's legacy really needs to be viewed more through bureaucratic, and that his role as a visionary in promoting Japanese air power was absolutely crucial to Japan's early war successes in that war. Pearl Harbor 2, yeah, okay, so I have some quibbles with it from a tactical planning standpoint, but obviously it was a successful operation tactically. You should be given that. But I would not put him up against cats like Spruance, was a much better admiral than Yamamoto.
Maybe that's, we give him a lot of credit because it's one of the greatest surprise attacks of all time. But you're right. He loses Midway, he loses Guadalcanal.
Yeah, that had he actually been more aggressive in the Solomon Islands, he could potentially have won that campaign. it was a desperate, desperate time in October on Guadalcanal. We were not
Yeah.
winning many of the naval battles down there, and the Marines were really feeling pretty isolated and, don't have sufficient men, don't have sufficient supplies. The Japanese Navy had the assets to make things a lot worse for us, and they never pushed the chips into the table.
Yeah. And I know he's still a revered figure in Japan.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I appreciate that overview of him, John. That was fantastic. Yeah. Again, if you'd like to learn more about John's book coming out in June, it's 1942 book, 1942book.com. So please check that out. And yeah, we're happy to have you on the show, John. This is great.
I appreciate it.